Hi, fantasy readers. This is Karyne Norton, your fellow bookbinger, and you are listening to the Finding Fantasy Reads podcast, where you can test out a new fantasy story every single week to find your next favorite author. Today, you get the privilege of hearing two stories from one fantastic author. Every once in a while, I throw out requests to authors who I don't expect to hear back from because while the podcast is growing, it's still not worth the attention of every author out there. I've had a couple close calls with authors willing to let me share their stories, but their contracts prevented them. I have no connections with Shea, so I was thrilled when she not only gave me permission to share the Duke's new clothes, but she also threw out the robber Maiden for me to share. Kitty is known for both her fairy tales and urban fantasy, although today's stories are from her fairy tale collection. She loves to write funny, clean stories with strong characters. Her philosophy is that life is tough, so books should be something that make you relax and laugh. The first story is one that I picked because I thought it was such a fun one to share, but the second story has a connecting series if you want to keep reading more. I'll be narrating the stories, but stick around to the end or check out today's show notes to see where you can find more from Kitty, as well as my own big announcement. For now, please enjoy The Duke's New Clothes and The Robber Maiden by K.M. Shea. The Duke's New Clothes. Angelique shifted in her side saddle and worked to keep a genteel smile on her face. Her horse, a buckskin gelding, plodded steadily after Évariste on his gray mount. For the sake of the event they were attending, Évariste had nudged Angelique into one of her fancier dresses, a white gown with wine-red lace and heart-shaped embroidery. Her horse was dressed to match. The blanket beneath her side saddle as well as the animal's barding were white with matching red embroidery. But Angelique had the pesky feeling they were overdressed, particularly given the state of the land they had passed through. She narrowed her eyes as she looked out at fields of stunted crops that were quite obviously wilting. On the other side of the pothole-riddled road was a fenced pasture that held a herd of 5 bony horses. The grass was chewed to the dirt. The wooden fence posts were half rotted, and the stable just beyond it fared little better. This is not a prosperous land. It was surprising, considering they were riding through a dukedom in Loire, the most powerful country on the continent. Angelique pressed her lips together and glanced at Évariste's back, wondering if she dared to ask him about the state of the fields. Her horse snorted and shook his head, ridding himself of a fly. "We have almost arrived," Évariste called over his shoulder. "The Duke's chateau should be visible after we pass that thicket of trees." He pointed to a small woods ahead of them and twisted in the saddle so he could smile at her. Angelique blinked owlishly. Between the sunlight, Évariste's brilliant smile, and his white clothes, it was a little hard to hold his gaze. He wore white trousers and a fancy jacket, which of course had red embroidery to match Angelique's, though his hearts were more of a dark burgundy color. "Is everything all right?" he asked when she didn't respond. "It's fine," Angelique said with a sunny voice. "It is merely... You said it is a duke we are here for, yes?" Évariste nodded. "He's throwing a rather extravagant party for his birthday." How extravagant can it be when his lands are in shambles? Aloud, she asked, "Isn't attending his birthday party a little too close to a political move?" "It toes the line," Évariste admitted. "If it weren't for you, I would never have accepted the job. But as you needed experience, our presence will not be viewed with the same scrutiny. The Veneno Conclave understands this." But do they really? Angelique kept her skepticism to herself, and instead made a noise of approval. She glanced back to the countryside and frowned, watching a farmer attempt to hack at a patch of dry, hardened dirt with a chipped hoe. Officially, the job is for you to create a set of illusionary clothes for the Duke to wear tonight for the entirety of his celebration, Évariste said. The way he phrased the directions made Angelique sit up. Officially? Is there unofficial business I am expected to conduct? Évariste held his horse back for a moment or two, so he could ride shoulder to shoulder with her. He smiled again, but it wasn't his charming or brilliant grin. Instead, it was dangerously close to a smirk. There is no unofficial business, but at all times, we should be aware of our duties as magic users. We are to guard the continent from magic and aid those in need, Angelique recited. The temperature cooled as the road meandered between the trees, shading them from the sun. Évariste nodded. Yes, and? Recalling the brat who cried wolf from Boyne, Angelique added, At times we might find it necessary to teach folk moral lessons. Exactly, Évariste said with great satisfaction. His smile turned warm again. As long as you remember that, you will do splendidly. Angelique was not so convinced, but she managed to hide it behind a false smile. It dropped from her lips, however, a few moments later when they emerged from the small forest, revealing the Duke's home. It was built more like a small castle than a proper chateau, as it was 3 floors of sparkling white stone with a red-tiled roof, 4 towers that Angelique could see, and a lush green yard with bushes trimmed to resemble animals. A giant fountain with an obnoxious gold sculpture of a man, the Duke most likely, was plopped in the middle of the road, which switched from dirt to cobblestone the moment they crossed the green lawn. His vast lands struggle to survive, and this is how his home looks? She glanced at Évariste. For once, he wasn't smiling, but was surveying the chateau. His unusual colored eyes were half shut, and his expressive lips were straight. Yes, Évariste said. This evening will be an excellent experience for you, and the Duke, too. The Duke, or His Grace Duke Hubert of Aube, was in his wardrobe room when Évariste and Angelique arrived, and it was there he stayed as his valet escorted Angelique and Évariste to him. Thierry, Duke Hubert called to his valet in a voice of exaggerated sadness. Thierry, you have failed me. I have nothing to wear. I shall be forced to meet magical greatness in a robe. His voice became more audible when the valet led Angelique and Évariste inside the wardrobe. The room was easily the size of the workshop back at Évariste's house, and clothes hung from rods fastened to the walls, from wires hung from the ceiling, and were tossed in great mounds that so cluttered the floor it was difficult to navigate. Angelique lifted her skirts to step over a shoe ornamented with a large blue bow and ducked to avoid getting an apple-green cape in her face. Your Grace, Lord Enchanter Évariste and his apprentice, Enchantress in training, Angelique, have arrived, the valet announced. Come in, Duke Hubert called. Come in, and you can see why I so badly need your help. Angelique and Évariste stepped around the last pile of clothes and found the Duke dressed in a brocade robe and perched on a spindly footstool. Duke Hubert was a short, skinny man who vaguely reminded Angelique of a drenched cat. His eyes bulged a little from emotion, and his wispy goatee made his already pointed chin appear downright angular. And he shook. With disdain, likely, but still. Angelique suspected she could have broken the man in half without using her magic. The Duke flung his arms up and motioned to the pile of clothes that surrounded him. It's terrible, simply terrible. I am a fashion setter. All Loire nobles are green with envy over my brilliant taste and beautiful clothes. But alas, I have nothing that can contain my glorious self." He sighed with great melancholy. Angelique had to smile. If she opened her mouth, she'd give him a tongue-lashing. How can he complain about his lavish clothes while his lands are on the brink of starvation? Or did he push them to this stage as a result of his thirst for luxuries? "We read as much in the letter you attached to the work details," Évariste said, his voice melodious and smooth. Angelique didn't know how he managed to be polite. She wanted to squeeze the Duke for his excess until his eyes popped more than they already did. "Then you will help me," the Duke imperiously stated. "Angelique will provide you with the magic you require this evening." Évariste took her hand and bowed over it like a knight honoring his lady. "I am here for her support." Angelique curtsied when the Duke peered at her, though she was distracted when Évariste raised her hand towards his lips and spent most of her attention on discreetly yanking her appendage free. "It will be my duty, Duke Hubert," she said, lacking any better description, because it certainly wasn't her honor. Duke Hubert stood and tried to look down his nose at her, but she was so much taller than him. He instead had to crank his neck to meet her eyes. "I expect magnificent clothes," he said, "made of cloth from the likes of which no one has seen." Angelique dipped her head. "Understood. However, I must remind you the clothes will be an illusion. It is not an outfit you will be able to keep." Duke Hubert scoffed. "Of course, that is why I sought to hire a mage. I must have an outfit so glorious. No one will have anything like it, nor will they be able to reproduce it. I shall wear sheer power this evening." His propensity to emphasize words was starting to grate on Angelique's nerves, but she kept smiling. Duke Hubert rubbed his scraggly facial hair and studied her. "It will be even more valuable given that an enchantress in training is performing the spell, though I should like it more if you were an official Lady Enchantress." He swung around to face Évariste. "Can you not be convinced, Lord Enchanter, to do the spell in place of your pupil?" "I must reject your request, Duke Hubert." Évariste's polite smile didn't so much as flicker. "I'll double the price," the Duke offered. The Lord Enchanter shook his head. "Angelique needs the practice, and to do such a thing would forsake my vow of impartiality when it comes to politics." The Duke rolled his eyes and planted his fists on his hips. "Magic is wasted on you upper mages. None of you seek to use your powers in a useful way. You could make peasants bow before you. But never mind. The work of an apprentice shall be good enough for tonight, as long as she makes a good show. Now, as for what I wish to wear." This is not just greed, but a power move, Angelique realized as she listened to the man rail on. He means to inflate his ego and show off his grandeur, that he has the money to hire an enchantress in training to weave a spell for him for a single night. Her smile twitched for a moment as she recalled the broken duchy she had ridden through. His vanity and pride spring from a source that will only bring ruin. She watched as he yammered on while he picked up a dark blue cape and pointed to the fancy jewel buttons before thoughtlessly tossing it on the ground. He stepped on it as he yanked a waistcoat from a hook on the wall. Unfortunately, it will be his lands that suffer. He needs to be taught better. But who? "It should sparkle in the candlelight, perhaps in this shade of plum." "If you'll forgive the interruption," Angelique smoothly cut in, "but if you truly wish for a magnificent outfit, as the magic user responsible for the spell, I must insist on being given full creative reign." Duke Hubert frowned. "Why?" Angelique's lips curled up in a smile that had a predatory gleam she couldn't quite hide. No one knows my abilities as a mage better than I, and I know the spells available to me as well. I can create clothes beyond your wildest imagination, and tonight I will do just that. Oh, the Duke blinked, then grudgingly nodded. I suppose that's true, but if I am not satisfied, you shall have to improve upon them. Worry not, Duke Hubert, Angelique promised. I will make you the clothes you so dearly deserve. The time has arrived. Duke Hubert swept out of his bathroom and scuttled across his dressing room, wearing a new robe, this one made of crimson velvet. The guests have been greeted. I have washed. You must now dress me. Angelique had been busy staring at the mounds of clothes cluttering up the room, but turned to face the bossy noble. She watched as he started to throw the robe off his skinny shoulders before Évariste placed a hand over her eyes. She said. Duke Hubert. Évariste's normally cheerful voice was smoky with anger. Though she is fulfilling a job, my pupil is a lady. You will act and treat her according to her station, and will not sully her eyes. Put on a shirt. My apologies, Duke Hubert gulped. Évariste must look quite fierce to get that sort of response. But Angelique was not surprised to see that, after he removed his hand from her eyes, his sunny smile was back in place. Figures. She glanced at the Duke, who was studiously avoiding eye contact with her as he stood in black stockings and a white dressing shirt that was several sizes too big. Évariste patted her on the shoulder. Good luck, apprentice. He smiled, then edged backwards, joining Duke Hubert's valet in standing by the entrance. There, he slightly tipped his head as he watched her. How perfectly splendid, and not at all worrisome. Angelique eyed the Duke, attempting to disguise her dislike of the man. But I had better perform well, or I'll hear it from the conclave, I'm sure, when Évariste's monthly report goes out. Angelique set her shoulders and put a smile on her lips. It will take just a moment so I can get a proper measure of you. She strolled in a circle around the knobby-kneed Duke. Of course! Duke Hubert puffed up his chest, straining to stand as tall as possible. As Angelique walked, she reached deep within herself and released the tiniest stream of magic. She carefully unwound it, measuring out only what she thought she would need, before corking up the trickle and shoving her magic down again. Her silvery magic splashed across her fingers as she twisted it, transforming it from the sharp, icy feel of her core magic into a delicate illusion spell. Her magic wrapped around the Duke, and though she had changed it, its core state must have still poked through, for Duke Hubert shivered and hunched his shoulders when it brushed him. Angelique furrowed her brow in concentration as she directed her magic, building the base of the outfit. Ruffled cuffs and collar appeared, before a stiff red doublet reinforced with boning enfolded his torso. Silk breeches, the same red as the doublet, puffed around his thighs and gathered at the knees. An elaborately embroidered slashed leather jerkin slipped over the top of his doublet, and Angelique finished the look with a wide-brimmed black cap. Though the clothes appeared solid, Angelique continued with the illusion, adding sparkles and fancy swirls to the doublet and jerkin, and a fancy feather to the cap. It's a shame this is only an illusion, and not alteration magic, she thought as she added a thick jeweled necklace of rubies. An illusion only looks real. Alteration changes something, for as long as I pour magic into it anyway. If I merely altered some of his clothes, I could have made them itchy and too small, for he certainly deserves some discomfort for his terrible management of his duchy. Thierry, a mirror, the Duke demanded. His valet carefully carried a full-length mirror, setting it down in front of him. He bowed before he scuttled off, but the Duke took no notice as he admired himself in the mirror. Very fine. Duke Hubert again puffed up his chest. I look magnificent, indeed. Clothes worthy of me, and of this very fortunate evening. They display my excellent taste and station. Angelique bit her cheek to keep from glaring at the man. She blinked as she watched him, carefully keeping her expression even. And now, time for the second part of this job. The self-appointed part, rather. She glanced at Évariste, but he was involved in a conversation with the valet and wasn't even looking her way anymore. Angelique smirked as she drifted closer to the Duke. It's entirely my duty, she thought. After all, Évariste has frequently reminded me our position might require us to deal our moral lessons. You do cut a fine figure, Angelique said in a sing-song tone, but I think I can do something more for you. You intend to give a speech to your esteemed guests, do you not? Indeed I shall, the Duke declared. How perfect, Angelique said. At the height of your speech, I will perform a special piece of magic, one that will perfectly reveal how worthy you are of your station. A spell that only the most intelligent of folk will be able to see. Truly? The Duke asked. Yes, Angelique promised. And when they see it, the eyes of your people shall be opened. Hopefully, it won't forever mentally scar them. Excellent. I approve of this artistic direction, Mage. Mage, he repeated, apparently having already forgotten her name. Angelique's smile turned true. It will be my pleasure. Angelique bit her lower lip, fighting back the impulse to yawn. Why is it that whenever someone thinks highly of themselves, they talk incessantly and are great bores? The Duke stood on a stone staircase that abutted the back side of his chateau, delivering his rambling speech to a group of barely listening nobles, dressed in bright and glittering clothes. The party was starting outside, where candles lined stone walking paths and blooming hedges walled in the courtyard area that was to serve as the first location for the evening's merrymaking. The party would, Angelique had been told, move indoors for dinner and end the night in the ballroom. Servants skulked around the edges of the courtyard, adding more candles and silently presenting guests with refreshments. Angelique stood with Enchanter Évariste and Thierry, Duke Hubert's valet, off to the side of the courtyard, visible but apart from the rest of the party attendees. She busied herself with brushing off the skirts of her white and red gown as she listened to the Duke prattle on. Thank you all for attending this celebration of me, the Duke of Aube. It is my greatest delight to host this birthday celebration, to welcome friends and family alike, to view the splendor of my duchy, and join me in merrymaking and joy. Angelique pursed her lips, caught between anger and worry. If I go through with this, am I overstepping my boundaries as a magic user? Teaching Duke Puffed Up a lesson could be interpreted as a political move after all. Her gaze was momentarily drawn to Thierry. The lanky young man had a bright smile, but the angles of his face were enunciated, and he appeared leaner than a man of his age should. The rest of the servants ghosting around the edges of the party were of a similar state, skinny and tired-looking. But the nail in the coffin was the so-called splendid duchy. That afternoon, while Duke Hubert had greeted his guests, Theory had taken Évariste and Angelique on a mini tour of the best lands in the duchy. All of the greenest places, the only fields that had not been overgrazed, and the lushest forests filled with any sort of wild game, were for the Duke's exclusive use. He had taken the best field and turned it into a circuit for horse races and an archery range for his guests. Duke Hubert had a lot of money. It was undeniable. But it was obvious he had earned so much in a short amount of time by neglecting his lands and failing to invest any back into his property and staff. It's a quick path to ruin that he's on, and he'll drag his duchy down with him. No, political or not, I've got to do something, particularly since I can use the excuse of a lowly apprentice mishandling a spell. Évariste might be a bit disappointed, but I don't think the Conclave could exile me over an accident. At least one that involves illusion magic, and not my core magic. Her mind made up, Angelique straightened and listened to the Duke's speech with the intensity of a wolf listening for prey. She tuned in at the perfect time, for he glanced in her direction, giving her a significant look. That's my cue. Angelique released a tendril of her magic and prepared to change her illusion spell. To showcase my remarkable taste, I have arranged an evening of luxuries of the like you have never seen before, Duke Hubert boasted. May it prove to you and reflect the superior taste of the Duchy of Aube, the worthiness of my character, and the nobility of my family. He threw his arms wide, and Angelique gestured, using her magic, to cut the illusion spell the Duke wore, shattering it so his fine clothes were gone, leaving the Duke in his undershirt and black stockings. At first, the Duke didn't appear to notice. He was gloating, his smile so big it was almost a grimace. His noble peers, however, certainly saw. A number of ladies dropped their feather-ornamented fans. Mouths fell open everywhere, and Angelique heard the telltale chime of crystal breaking. Dropped chalices, for certain. The Duke's servants had a very different reaction. More than one of them slapped a hand over their mouths to keep from laughing. Their eyes bulged, and they, knowing the magic user behind the spell, yanked their gazes from Duke Hubert to Angelique. Angelique delicately placed a hand on her cheek. Oh my, she said in false horror, her eyes wide. I have terribly bungled this. The Duke finally appeared to realize something was wrong, for he looked down at his chest, and his eyes nearly popped out of his head. He made a loud squeaking noise, and his face turned red with anger. Angelique slightly angled herself to the side so Évariste wouldn't be able to view her expression head-on. In doing so, she was able to meet Duke Hubert's gaze, and she dropped her expression of horror. Instead, she raised an eyebrow and looked from the Duke to his undershirt, then mouthed the words, How worthy you are of your station. Duke Hubert went from bright red to an ashen pallor, perfectly grasping what she was trying to get at. Her spell had revealed just how worthy he was, and had found him wanting. With some help from me, of course. Angelique met his gaze for several moments, until the Duke went back to awkwardly staring out at his guests. Sensing it was time for the moral lesson to end, lest she go too far, she turned back to Évariste. She blinked her eyes, giving the appearance of tears of regret, although really they were more tears born from holding back the great guffaws of laughter she wanted to release. I'm so sorry, Enchanter Évariste. I will make amends. Angelique snapped her still waiting magic into place, reconstructing the broken illusion in moments. Clothes reappeared on the startled Duke, but he didn't so easily recover his bravado. Instead, he brushed his doublet and cleared his throat. Yes. Let the celebration begin, he weakly said. His guests murmured as they finally recovered their air of sophistication. Every eye was on him as he hurried down the stairs. Theory coughed several times, covering what suspiciously sounded like a chuckle, before he turned to Angelique and Évariste. If you'll excuse me, Lord Enchanter, Lady Enchantress, I believe His Grace may need my help. He bowed and hurried off. I'm not an enchantress, Angelique finished, even though it became apparent Theory wasn't stopping to hear her correction. She frowned, which transformed into a smile when she watched Duke Hubert cling to Theory's arm. Yes, that might not have fixed anything, but with luck, it at least planted a thought. That was a very smooth and quick recovery, Évariste praised. Angelique almost jumped in her shoes, having forgotten about his presence. Thank you, but it was very shameful I dropped it. She made a show of biting her lip and glanced at the Duke. I shall redouble my efforts to keep the spell stable for the rest of the evening. She then bowed her head to the Lord Enchanter. I am sorry for failing you. She added in real honesty. I don't like to let Évariste down, but I still don't regret it. This one instance, anyway. Accidents happen, Évariste said serenely. He took Angelique's hand and briefly patted it before releasing her and clasping his hands behind his back. You're an apprentice. It is expected you would make the occasional mistake, he said. And this was a relatively small one, given how quickly you righted it. Angelique whipped her head up to gawk at her teacher. For in what continent could this be construed as a small error? But Évariste had begun moving away, and only his back was visible. Come, apprentice, he called. We should mingle with the guests. It's a chance for you to meet the most powerful nobles in Loire, after all. Does he approve of my error? Angelique wondered as she briefly studied his back. He doesn't know I did it on purpose, does he? If he did, I think he would at least scold me. Not even Évariste can be that even-tempered. Some of her glee subsided at the thought, and Angelique shook her head. Yes, he can't know. Évariste would never praise me for purposely failing at a task, even if the Duke deserved it. Would he? She pushed the thought from her mind, and instead fixed a smile on her lips as she glided after her teacher, winking at the maid she passed, who was bearing a tray of drinks. Regardless, with that illusion snipped, I can consider tonight a true triumph. Évariste had to speed walk away from his apprentice to keep her unaware of the laughter he was struggling to hold in. Duke Hubert is such a pompous, self-centered man. She devastated him and shattered that pride without uttering a single threat or harming a single person. She is incredible. When he first agreed to the job for Angelique's sake, Évariste dreaded the party. He had seen Duke Hubert before, when visiting the Loire royal family in Noyers. He hoped Angelique might attempt to teach the man a lesson, but he never imagined the delivery method she would use to do such a thing. I thought if I hinted before we arrived, she might make a threat or extract some sort of promise from the Duke to treat his land better. Instead, she took him to task herself. It had been a steep gamble on her part. If she had been a graduated enchantress, there would be repercussions. But she was a mere apprentice, and Évariste's reputation wouldn't even rock from the events of this evening. She is special. He paused long enough to look over his shoulder and smile as she glided after him with the practiced grace of an elf. Though she might be afraid of her own magic, she's not afraid to stand for what is right. I hope she can keep that spirit. No, I must see that she remains that way, for the good of the continent. His reasoning rang hollow, even in the privacy of his own mind. Évariste was not nearly delusional enough to think that perhaps he cared a little too much for the well-being of his apprentice, only for the sake of the continent. Still, he couldn't find it in himself to care. She's worth fighting for, worth protecting, and worth waiting for. Évariste barely kept himself from cringing, for that last thought was a dangerous one. But he didn't retract it. Instead, he smiled brightly as he chose a noble at random to greet. Ah, Lord Foy, please allow me to introduce you to my apprentice, Angelique. The Robber Maiden. Fili, robber maiden of Barris and daughter of Leonia, the famed leader of the dishonorable knaves, was splayed across a rafter like it was a feather-stuffed mattress. She tossed Fotis, her ugly dagger, in the air and caught it by hilt. She lazily spun it around a finger, then used it to scratch her side. She yawned and flipped over onto her stomach so she could watch chosen officers swarm beneath her like little ants. Nothing has changed. I first heard the rumors of a royal ice magic user in the south and tracked the whispers north. But since then, nothing. She had been, for the most part, following the trail left behind by the 1st Regiment, the most well-trained and well-disciplined regiment of the chosen army. The majority of the regiment's forces were stationed in Ostfold, where she was kicking up her heels for the moment as she waited for a whisper, for a breath of information about the famed exiled Verglas princess. But there was nothing. Maybe she doesn't exist after all. Perhaps they were only fanciful rumors, and she was killed as a child. The thought made her grimace. Fili never understood what about magic made so many people act toady and stupid. Fili blinked when a bright light flickered on the wall. Frowning, she followed the light to a garbed officer, Colonel Cavan. She recognized him as he had arrived in Ostfold the day before with a supply train and several of his squads. They were due to leave in a few hours and head south again. What is he holding that is casting a reflective light? Jewels? I bet at the very least it is something expensive. Her interest piqued. Fili peeled herself off her beam and ghosted across the rafters, watching warily that she did not catch any attention. No one looked up, so she followed the perimeter of the room, cursing under her breath when Colonel Cavan, a handsome man who wore an unfortunately dark-looking smirk that considerably dampened his charm, left the hall. King's toes, she muttered. She abandoned the rafters and was forced to climb up the wall, built with unfortunately slick rock bricks that were difficult to get a toe or finger hold on. She heaved herself into a ventilation slit that opened into the outside and huffed at the disagreeably cold temperature. Verglas winters. Why does anyone live here? A body is not meant to survive these extreme conditions. She picked her way across the slippery roof and jumped from one building to the next, pausing long enough to cast a glance at some of the palace ruins. The chosen army had not been kind when it took the Verglas palace. Parts of it had been burned down, and some of the outer walls were ripped to shreds. Fili tracked her quarry across the palace. Sometimes she had to shimmy down the walls and press her face against glass windows to see where he was going, and she almost lost him when he took the long route around the library. She was surprised when he left the palace and entered a snowed-over flower garden. She crouched on the edge of the roof like a gargoyle, her teeth chattering, as she watched him study whatever was in his hands. When the colonel turned to look north, Philae picked her way down the wall and drew as close to him as she dared, crouching behind a shrub. She glared at him as she pulled her jacket tighter, trying to keep warm in the frigid wind. Colonel Cavan, oblivious to her presence, studied the impassable mountain range that cradled northern Verglas. "Where are you?" he murmured. His smirk turned into a grimacing smile as Philae stared at him in shock and awe. What sort of idiot comes outside in this weather to talk to himself? Irritated, she popped out from behind her snow-covered bush and slithered into an evergreen tree, sweating with the effort it took to avoid shaking the tree as she crawled between its branches. The new position gave her a better view, allowing her to see that Colonel Cavan held what looked like a shard of a mirror in his hands. As he caressed the surface, Philae could almost feel something evil radiating from the shard. She shivered. It wasn't the first mirror shard she had seen. Tenebris Malice, leader of the Chosen, and another one of his colonels possessed mirror shards as well. But why? Colonel Cavan slipped the shard in a pocket and sauntered back to the palace. He brushed against Philae's tree, and without thinking, she picked his pocket. Her swift fingers eased into his pocket as the needle-like branches brushed his side. Cavan looked straight into the tree and brushed his sides with a frown. Philae held her breath. Had he felt it? He walked away, whistling a tune and stamping his feet when he left the garden for an open-air corridor. Philae watched him leave, exhaling with relief when he fell out of sight and hearing range. That was risky. Mother would have paddled me for fumbling on such an oblivious target. She pinched the mirror shard between two fingers and frowned at it. It was about as big as her thumb and dangerously sharp, though the surface appeared to be too warped to properly show a reflection. It was pretty disappointing to look at, considering the people of power that all seemed to possess one. Perhaps it helps them communicate? Philae left her tree and climbed up the side of the palace, flipping onto the ceiling just in time to avoid a set of patrolling soldiers. Judging by the amount of medals and trim sewn to their uniforms, they were probably magic users. She was about to roll to her feet and pick her way back across the ruined palace when the soldiers spoke. "Good afternoon, Healer Sunira." "Good afternoon. You need to report in to your patrol leader as swiftly as possible." Philae peeked over the edge of the ceiling so she hung upside down and watched with interest as a pretty woman handed the magic users a scroll. "Is something wrong, Healer Sunira?" one of the men asked. "Of a sort. We've received orders from Farron Graydam. He's pulling out a few squads of foot soldiers and several fellow magic users. Your rotation is changing to cover for the loss." "He needs more troops? Why? I thought there were only a few mountain villages left." "There are. Apparently, one of those villages was the supply hub for the exiled Princess Raquel," the woman said. Philae almost lost her hold on the roof in her glee. "She's real?" a soldier marveled. "Frighteningly so. She's already beaten back our forces and retaken 2 villages. Report in to your patrol leader for more details." "Yes, ma'am." Philae pulled herself back onto the roof just before the woman turned in her direction. She grinned from ear to ear as she felt her pocket for the mirror shard. So, she exists, does she? Wonderful. Perhaps now Verglas will be able to fight back. Though I imagine the state of the country will make her suspicious of outside help. What great luck it is, then, that I have a token to offer her, she said, thinking of the mirror shard she had just swiped. She hopped, skipped, and leaped her way across the palace, intending to sniff out a copy of the orders. She needed to find out where the mythical royal was making her stand. Princess, I so look forward to meeting you. I hope you enjoyed listening to The Duke's New Clothes and The Robber Maiden by K.M. Shea, narrated by Karyne Norton. If you want to read more by Kitty, go to kmshea.com to find more of her books. The Robber Maiden is part of her Snow Queen series, so you may want to start with that. I mentioned that I had my own big announcement, which probably sounded more ominous than it needed to. Thankfully, people no longer assume I'm pregnant when I say something like that, but I do have a brand new book baby that entered the world yesterday. Blood of the Stars was first released with the Kickstarter I ran last fall, but now it's available in paperback and hardcover through most retailers, and it's available on ebook through Amazon. If you have a Kindle Unlimited membership, it's free to read in there as well. The audiobook will be coming, but we don't have an exact release date for that, and it will be read by Pater and me. If you enjoy listening to my prequel short story back on episode 16 in September, you'll love getting to hear how things play out for Garen and Aeliana in Blood of the Stars. I'll have links for you to find it in the show notes. Thank you all for listening, and happy reading.